Hello folks, and welcome to our quarterly digital briefing from May 2022. This quarter's global digital report focused on the fact that the world has just reached 5 billion internet users, which is a huge milestone on our journey towards universal digital accessibility. Now, we dedicated a significant portion of this quarter's written analysis to that story, so do check that out over on datareportal.com if you want to dig deeper into the numbers. However, for today's briefing, we're going to look at a variety of broader trends and their potential impact on brands and marketing. Topics in this quarter's briefing include the state of Web3 and the metaverse, whether it's time to rethink channel planning, some intriguing developments on TikTok, whether Facebook is becoming less relevant, and then we'll finish up by making sense of some recent e-commerce headlines and trends. Just before we get into the numbers, if this is your first time attending one of these briefings, thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Simon Kemp, and I run Kepios, which is an advisory and intelligence company that, amongst other things, produces the Global Digital Report series on behalf of Hootsuite and We Are Social. Our Digital 2022 April Global Statshot report is the latest update in that ongoing series, but remember that you can read all of our reports from the past 10 years, and all for free, over on datareportal.com. And remember that my presentation today will only be the start of today's insights as well. The real value of these briefings lies in our subsequent discussion, so please be sure to note down any questions, doubts, or challenges that come to mind during this video, and we can explore those in more detail during the Q&A. But with that, let's get straight into the briefing, starting with a look at the latest global state of digital. And as I already mentioned, our big headline this quarter is that there are now more than 5 billion people around the world using the internet. That means that 63% of the world's total population is now online, with the global user total increasing by almost 200 million over the past 12 months. Our analysis of the available data does suggest that internet user growth has slowed in recent months, but it's unclear how much of this slowdown might be due to the ongoing delays in research and data reporting caused by COVID, rather than any change in actual growth trends. However, we've also seen a slowdown in social media growth over the past few months, so it's looking increasingly likely that recent trends are showing a return to more subdued growth following the rapid expansion that we saw during the height of the pandemic. And I think that we should expect to see more modest growth from here on too, especially now that the majority of the world is online. Now, for context, current trends suggest that we are on track to see 2/3 of all the people on Earth using the internet by the middle of next year. But with twice as many people using the internet as not, it's going to become increasingly difficult to connect each remaining person who remains offline. We're still seeing impressive milestones in the latest figures for digital adoption though. The latest data from CNNIC reveals that there are now more than 1 billion social media users in China. Overall, there are now 4.65 billion social media users around the world, which equates to 58.7% of the world's total population. And that global total has increased by 7.5% over the past 12 months, for a total of 326 million new users. Now, that's quite a bit slower than the 13.7% annual growth that we reported this time last year. But for context, social media users are still growing at an average of more than 10 new users every second. Growth rates for mobile adoption are more modest and offer a fairly representative benchmark for where we might expect to see internet and social media growth rates settle over the coming years. GSMA Intelligence reports that unique mobile users are currently growing by 1.7% per year, although it is worth highlighting that somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion of these people are still limited to a feature phone handset. So while overall mobile adoption may not be growing very quickly, the number of smartphone users is probably growing at a faster pace. Now, it's worth noting that many people around the world continue to use both a smartphone and a feature phone, but data from Ericsson shows that smartphones now account for more than 4 in 5 of the 8 billion mobile connections in use today. But I know that many of you have one eye on the future too, so let's take a look at adoption rates for some of the more innovative side of connected tech. And let's start by exploring Web3. Now, for clarity, the primary focus of Web3 is decentralization, with blockchain technology underpinning most of the current tech. Now, it's tricky to identify just how widespread the adoption of these technologies has become amongst everyday people, but levels of ownership of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin can offer a useful reference. And the latest data from GWI shows that almost 1 in 9 working-age internet users around the world now own some form of crypto, although that figure rises above 20% in Turkey, the Philippines, Argentina, and in Thailand. Adoption is still heavily male-skewed though, with men currently 50% more likely to own a digital currency than women are at a global level. Ownership does appear to be growing quickly though, with the number of working-age adults who say that they own at least one form of cryptocurrency jumping by more than 40% over the past 12 months. However, NFT activity has tumbled over recent weeks. Data from nonfungible.com shows that trading activity in the first week of May was more than 90% lower than it was in September 2021. And meanwhile, Chainalysis reports that there are now about 5 NFTs available for every buyer. So, if you've been considering an NFT activity for your brand's marketing or PR, you might want to review your plans and expectations. That advice only relates to speculative marketing activity though, and I would suggest that NFTs are still well worth exploring for people like artists and musicians. The technology underpinning NFTs isn't going to disappear anytime soon either, and I'm confident that these blockchain-based contracts will play an important part in shaping the future of business contracts and content revenue models. As for the metaverse, it's worth noting that we're unlikely to see just one metaverse, especially because so many corporate entities are trying to build walled garden environments. And it's also worth remembering that virtual online worlds have been around for some time now. For example, Second Life, which is a perfect example of a metaverse, has been around for almost 20 years now, and while it's admittedly not quite as hot as it was 15 years ago, it still has millions of active users. However, a number of newer online worlds have attracted much larger populations. Data from ActivePlayer.io suggests that Fortnite has attracted 270 million active users per month, and highlighting its metaverse credentials, the platform also already hosts regular music concerts and fashion shows. And to put these figures in context, data suggests that Fortnite already has as many monthly active users as Quora does. Roblox is also hugely popular, with over 200 million monthly active users, while Minecraft also attracts 170 million active players per month. So it's already clear that metaverses wield huge appeal. However, I suspect it'll take some time before the commercial opportunities that these worlds offer extend beyond gaming. So unless your brand has a close tie to gaming or to virtual goods, please think very carefully about the opportunity cost of getting involved in metaverses for now, as compared with all the other things that you could spend your marketing budget on. Metaverses may well become a compelling market opportunity in the second half of this decade, but it's probably better to focus your attention on more tangible opportunities for now. And the good news is that existing opportunities like social media marketing continue to grow. However, that doesn't mean that we can simply rely on business as usual. In order to take full advantage of current opportunities, we may need to rethink our approach, even when it comes to fundamentals like channel planning. Now, for context, as we've seen numerous times during these briefings, the typical user now makes active use of multiple social media platforms every month. And we've also seen how much those audiences tend to overlap, and how barely 1% of the users of any given social platform are unique to that platform. However, as we started to explore last quarter, the reasons why people use different platforms tend to vary quite meaningfully from one platform to another. For example, messaging friends and family is the most common activity on Facebook, whereas looking for funny and entertaining content dominates on TikTok. But what should we be doing with these insights? Well, for me, one potential takeaway from this data is that we may want to rethink how we divvy up our budgets. Most companies still tend to allocate marketing investments into channel buckets. For example, you might allocate 25% of your digital spend to social media. But in light of our audience's increasingly varied social media motivations, activities, and preferences, does it still make sense to allocate budgets to somewhat arbitrary buckets like social media? Considering the reasons why people use each platform, should we really be comparing TikTok to Instagram when divvying up our media budget, or might it make more sense to compare TikTok with other entertainment channels like TV? Now, for clarity, I'm not saying that channel planning is dead or that any of these approaches is right and that the others are wrong. I'm simply suggesting that it might be time for us to take a step back and look at how we divide our budgets and explore whether there might be better, more representative ways of doing so. And my suggestion here is that you may want to explore allocating budgets based on people's behaviours and motivations, rather than simply based on media or delivery mechanisms. While we're on the subject of entertainment content, though, it's worth touching on a couple of the developments that came out of Netflix's most recent earnings announcement. As you may have seen, Netflix has been battling with a drop in subscriber numbers across some of its top markets, and many analysts expect that this will result in the company launching an ad-supported tier to its offerings as well. Now, there's no official timeline for the launch of the ad-supported option yet, but it's unlikely to be available to the public before the end of this year. It's already worth starting to think about where ads on streaming platforms might sit within your broader mix, though, especially because streaming accounts for an ever greater share of the world's TV time. Now, I still believe that things like product placement and content partnerships offer more compelling opportunities than interruptive ads do when it comes to streaming. However, I also recognise that ads will likely become irresistible to most large marketers once they become available, especially given the potential for highly targeted and contextual placements. So, my tip here is to open discussions with platforms like Netflix now, so that you're ready when the options are finally available. Meanwhile, one of the most intriguing findings in this quarter's report relates to the ways in which some social media platforms have been diversifying their revenue streams away from ads. Now, for context, most of the big Western platforms are still almost entirely dependent on ad revenue. Figures reported in Meta's latest earnings announcement show that the company makes 96.7% of its total revenues from advertising. But Meta isn't alone in depending on ad revenue. Twitter's latest numbers suggest that 92.5% of its total revenues come from ads, while Snapchat reports that substantially all of its revenue comes from advertising. However, a quite different story is emerging over at ByteDance. The company is an increasingly powerful force in advertising, of course, and ads on its TikTok platform already reach almost 1 billion adults aged 18 plus every month. And for additional context, eMarketer reports that TikTok earned a total of $4 billion from advertising in 2021 outside of China, and that the company plans to triple that figure in 2022. However, ads aren't the only way that TikTok's making money. Over the past 12 months, ByteDance has also earned more than $2 billion from its users' in-app purchases of coins across TikTok and its Chinese sister app, Douyin. And critically, the purchase of these coins has very little to do with advertising. Rather, TikTok coins are paid for by the platform's end users and can be used to tip creators for their content, similar to how we might throw coins into the guitar case of a real-world busker. ByteDance is still a private company, so eMarketer's ad revenue figures are just estimates. But our analysis of these data points suggests that the value of consumer purchases of TikTok coins already equates to roughly 1/3 of the revenues that the company earns from advertising. And for even more impressive context, TikTok now earns more from consumers' in-app purchases than any other app in the world, including the world's top mobile games. But the big takeaway here isn't just about potential revenue models. Perhaps more importantly, the amount of money that users are willing to spend on TikTok coins demonstrates just how much value they place on the content that they are finding on these platforms. And remember, these figures tell us that over the past 12 months alone, people have decided to spend more than $2 billion of their own hard-earned cash to tip creators for content that they could otherwise have enjoyed for free on TikTok. So where does that leave advertising content on the platform? More specifically, can branded content on TikTok compete with the sort of creator-originated content that inspires our audiences to spontaneously offer them a financial reward for it? Stretching that thinking even further, could we create content that was worthy of audience tips? And could we even turn content into a profit center? Now, this isn't actually too far-fetched when we consider the kind of content published by Red Bull, who have already turned their media house into a revenue-generating outfit. But it's the flip side of that question that offers the greatest pause for thought. If your content isn't worthy of audience tips, will people even notice it in a feed full of other content that is? Now, it's easy to dismiss this kind of challenge, but I strongly encourage you to take that thought away with you today and ask yourself how you might create content that's genuinely worthy of earning audience tips. But at the same time as TikTok has been enjoying these impressive headlines, Facebook has been having a tougher time of it. So is it finally time to deprioritize Facebook? Now, as part of our work at Kepios, we spend a lot of time talking to journalists, and one of the questions that's been coming up a lot recently is whether Facebook is dying. Now, to be clear, this isn't a new question, and the first time a journalist asked me this was back in 2011, when Facebook had 3 times fewer active users than it does today. However, the fact that this question still comes up so frequently reinforces something that I say regularly on these briefings. We need to be very wary of using media headlines to inform our marketing plans. Now, I am sure that certain studies do indeed find that certain demographics in certain countries are using Facebook less than they used to. However, the majority of reputable data tells quite a different story. And our analysis reveals that Facebook's advertising audience continued to grow in the first 3 months of 2022, with global reach increasing by 32 million, or 1.5%, between January and April, despite the platform losing millions of users in Russia due to the impact of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Furthermore, Facebook's teenage audience is still growing too. The platform's advertising numbers show that Facebook added almost 3 million users between the ages of 13 and 19 in the first 90 days of this year. And for clarity, these numbers are based on users who have been active on the platform at least once in the past 30 days, so they represent active use, not just registered accounts. And beyond user numbers, analysis from data.ai also reveals that the average amount of time that people spend using Facebook actually increased over the past 12 months, albeit only slightly. So, with figures for both user numbers and time spent continuing to increase, it seems that tales of Facebook's death have been largely exaggerated. That doesn't mean that Facebook is the only platform out there, of course, nor does it mean that it's the only option that you should consider. However, if media headlines have you spooked and wondering whether you should reduce your Facebook spend, I think you can rest assured that Facebook will remain one of the most compelling options in the digital mix for the foreseeable future. But while we're talking of headlines, there's another media story that's been doing the rounds in recent weeks that I'd like to cover in our next section. Now, you may have seen one of the numerous variations of this chart that shows the share of total retail sales attributable to e-commerce. Now, the graph certainly makes for interesting reading, but the narrative that accompanies it hasn't always delivered the most balanced of analyses. For starters, this data only represents retail activity in the United States and doesn't necessarily correlate with patterns we'll see elsewhere, like in Europe or in Asia. More importantly, though, I suspect that people's behaviours in recent months have been shaped by the change in accessibility of different retail channels. Now, it's quite easy to understand this jump in Q2 2020, when the pandemic really took hold across North America. However, many people still enjoy visiting physical stores, so it's perhaps not surprising to see spending actively returning to high streets and malls now that people have more of a choice. Much of the commentary that I've seen around this chart points to the fact that e-commerce growth has now returned to roughly the same trajectory that we saw prior to the pandemic, with some analysts even questioning whether the recent decline in e-commerce's share will continue. But my take is that we're going to see something of a heartbeat chart here. We had a sudden spike in the early days of COVID, which has since dropped back down to the pre-COVID trend line. Now, we may even see online share drop below that pre-COVID baseline over the next couple of quarters, especially as people continue to return to the physical stores that were closed at the height of the pandemic. However, I'd be very surprised if we don't see online share of retail return to levels above that pre-pandemic trajectory by the end of next year, and perhaps even sooner than that, and especially outside of the United States. And one of the reasons for this is the continued growth that we're seeing in the adoption of online grocery shopping. Now, data from GWI shows that the number of people around the world who order groceries online each week increased by 10% during 2021, despite physical stores becoming increasingly accessible during that period. Meanwhile, Statista reports that online grocery spend increased significantly during 2021 too, with global revenues more than 35% higher than equivalent 2020 spend. Now, these findings have clear implications for any brand operating in the grocery category, but their impact isn't restricted to food and drink. And in fact, our analysis of e-commerce trends over the past decade has shown that growth in the online grocery category consistently translates into higher growth across other categories in the following months too. And this is partly because of the frequency associated with grocery shopping, which helps to keep online channels top of mind. However, the increased comfort and confidence that comes with a rise in online grocery shopping may also translate into an increase in online shopping in new categories too, especially those in which the shopper hasn't made any previous e-commerce purchases. So, while it's definitely important to track developments like the trends in this chart, it's also important to understand the underlying context, broader trends, and the behaviours in your specific market and category. Now, sadly, that's all we've got time for in this quarter's briefing presentation, but the good news is that we've still got plenty of time for your questions. Here's a quick reminder of the topics that I've covered today to help jog your memory for any questions that you do want to ask in the Q&A. As always, remember that you can also find all of our latest reports and in-depth analysis over on datareportal.com, including all the latest data for social media audiences by country. Now, a quick note that I'll be back with you again for our Q3 briefing in August. And I know that many of you will start looking ahead to 2023 next quarter too. So if there are any things that you'd like me to add to my list for analysis in next quarter's briefing, please let me know ASAP. And if you'd like to stay up to date with our updates ahead of that briefing, here are a few of the places that you can find those. But with that, I'll hand things back over to you to kick off our Q&A.